I awoke in a broom closet to an old man standing over me asking, "Who are you?" "I don't know," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. The man frowned. "This building's been closed for years. No one's supposed to be in here." He stepped back, gripping his mop handle tighter, eyes darting to the door like he might run. "I think I work here," I said automatically, though the words felt wrong. He shook his head. "They tore this place down after that girl went missing." My chest tightened. "What girl?" He didn't answer. I pushed past him and stumbled into the hallway. Someone had been here. Maybe whoever brought me here. I met a security guard outside. He sat in a booth by the gate, drinking coffee. "Sir!" I shouted, running toward him. "Please, I need help!" He looked up and dropped his cup. "Holy cow." His eyes went wide. "You're Emily. Do you know me?" I asked, stopping suddenly. He nodded slowly. "You disappeared 6 years ago. Everyone thought you were dead." I stared at him. "That can't be right." He swallowed. "They found your car by the river. Blood in it. Police said it was foul play." I stepped back, dizzy. "No, I woke up in the broom closet." He picked up his radio, then hesitated. "If you're who I think you are, people are gonna lose their minds." I turned and ran. I needed to see my mother. I found her address in a wallet left in the closet. Inside was a photo of me as a child, her handwriting on the back. When she opened the door, she froze. Her eyes filled with tears. "Emily?" "Mom," I said, voice trembling. She pressed her hands to her mouth, shaking her head. "This isn't possible. It's me." She stepped closer but didn't touch me. "They told us you were gone. We searched everywhere." "I don't remember anything after work," I said. "Then I woke up there." Her eyes darted over my shoulder. "Who let you go?" "What?" "You were taken," she said, her voice breaking. "They said it was some drifter. They never found him." My voice caught. "I don't remember him." She started crying. "He kept you all this time?" I felt sick. "I don't know." She reached for my hand and I flinched without meaning to. Her eyes filled with horror. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What did he do to you?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. I met with the detective who showed up an hour later. "Emily Carter," he said quietly. "You've been missing 2,184 days." He set a cup of tea in front of me. "Do you remember where you were?" "No," I said. "Just that room." He studied my face carefully. "You look the same. Exactly the same." I glanced down at my hands. Pale. Smooth. Not 6 years older. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying something doesn't fit. You disappeared without a trace, and now you're here with no ID, no explanation, no sign of aging. Whoever had you, they hid you well." I stared at him. Why would someone keep me alive for 6 years and then just let me go? He sighed before answering. "Sometimes they want to see what happens when you come back." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mother had insisted I stay in my old room, but I wasn't alone. I felt it before I heard it, the quiet creak of the window opening. I sat up. A shadow stood outside the window, half hidden by the darkness. My heart stopped. He didn't move closer, just stood there watching. I whispered, "Who are you?" A low, steady voice said, "You remember my voice, don't you?" The words sent lightning through my chest. I did remember it. Somewhere deep inside, in the blur between dreams and nightmares. "What do you want?" I whispered. He shook his head slowly. "You're free now." I swallowed hard. "Why? Why did you take me?" "You were lost," he said. "I just kept you." "Kept me?" He nodded. "You didn't fight. You stopped asking to leave. You smiled sometimes. You were quiet. Safe." Tears stung my eyes. "You ruined my life." He blinked, almost confused. "No," I gave it back. He turned to go, melting into the dark. "Wait, Dad, is that you?" The figure froze for a second, then moved backward fast, swallowed by the darkness beyond the fence. I pressed my face against the glass, but he was gone. Just empty yard and shadows. My hands shook against the windowsill. The word hung in the air between us. That single word I didn't mean to say. Mom's footsteps pounded up the stairs. The door flew open and she stood there breathing hard, eyes wild as they swept the room. She saw me at the window, saw my face and rushed over. Her hands grabbed my shoulders and turned me around, checking for injuries or signs of struggle. She looked past me into the backyard, seeing nothing but darkness and the neighbor's fence. I opened my mouth to explain, but she was already at the window, yanking it shut and flipping the lock. The click echoed too loud in the quiet room. She tested it twice, pulling hard on the frame to make sure it held. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. I tried to tell her what happened, about the figure and the voice and how I knew him somehow, but she cut me off. She said the window was locked when she went to bed, that she checked it herself like she always does. She said no one could have opened it from outside without breaking something. I sat on the bed wrapped in my old quilt while she moved through the house checking every window, every door, every possible entry point. I heard her downstairs testing locks, sliding chains into place, pushing furniture against doors. The house creaked and settled around us. When she came back, her face looked older somehow, more tired. She sat next to me and wrapped her arm around my shoulders, and I felt her whole body trembling. We stayed like that until the sky started turning gray with morning, neither of us sleeping, both of us listening for sounds that never came. The voice stayed in my head, though, low and steady, asking if I remembered. I did remember something. Not words or faces, but a feeling, like safety mixed with something darker I couldn't name. Harrison showed up before 8, earlier than normal visiting hours should allow. He had coffee stains on his shirt and circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept either. Mom let him in, and he sat across from me at the kitchen table, pulling out a small notebook and pen. His questions came different this time, careful and pointed. He asked if I'd been feeling confused lately, if I was having trouble separating dreams from reality. He asked if I'd experienced any hallucinations, or heard voices that weren't there. I could see it in his face, the way his eyes tracked my movements, how he wrote down everything I said. He thought I was losing it, that the trauma was making me see things that didn't exist. I tried to explain that the voice was real, that someone was actually at my window, but his expression stayed neutral and concerned. He asked about my mental state before I disappeared, if I'd ever had episodes or breaks from reality. Mom jumped in then, defensive, saying I'd always been completely stable and healthy. Harrison nodded and made more notes. I mentioned how the voice felt familiar, like I should know it even though I couldn't remember why. That made Harrison stop writing. He looked up at me with something new in his eyes, something closer to worry than suspicion. He leaned forward and asked if I remembered anyone from the past 6 years, any faces or names or places. The question hit me weird because I realized the answer was nothing. 6 years gone and not a single memory of who kept me or where I was. My mind was just blank space where those years should be. Harrison watched me process that, watched my face change as the reality sank in. He made a phone call right there at the table, speaking low to someone about trauma specialists and memory recovery. When he hung up, he said he was setting me up with a forensic psychologist, someone who works with people who've been through what I went through. The appointment was 2 days away, Thursday afternoon. 2 days felt impossible, like years stretching out when I needed answers now. Harrison left after making Mom promise to call if anything else happened, if I saw or heard anything unusual. The way he said it made clear he expected more hallucinations, not actual threats. After he left, I sat at the table staring at nothing while Mom cleaned up the coffee cups. The doorbell rang that afternoon and Mom answered it carefully, checking through the window first. Nadine stood on the porch holding flowers, her face already crumpling before the door fully opened. She was older than I remembered, lines around her eyes that weren't there before. When she saw me, she made this sound, half sob, half gasp, and the flowers dropped to the floor. She rushed forward and grabbed me in a hug that squeezed too tight, her whole body shaking against mine. She kept saying my name over and over, saying she knew it. She always knew I was alive somewhere. We sat in the living room and she couldn't stop staring at me, touching my hand like she needed to confirm I was real. She said she reported me missing that first night when I didn't show up for our usual coffee date. She talked about how she called and called, how she drove to my apartment and found it empty, how she knew something was wrong. The police found my car the next morning by the river, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. She described the blood on the steering wheel. Not much, but enough to make everyone assume the worst. They dragged the river for weeks looking for my body. Nadine's voice broke when she talked about the searches, the volunteers combing through woods and fields, the dogs that found nothing. She said the case went cold after 6 months, that eventually people stopped looking and started accepting I was gone. I asked her what I was like before, desperate to understand who I used to be. She smiled through tears and described someone I didn't recognize. She said I was always planning trips and adventures, always the first to suggest trying something new. She said I talked about moving to a bigger city, about going back to the school, about a dozen different dreams I was chasing. That person felt completely foreign to me now, like she was describing a stranger. I was quiet now, uncertain, nothing like the ambitious social person she remembered. Nadine noticed the difference too. I could see it in how carefully she chose her words, how she kept glancing at Mom with worried eyes. That night I fell asleep without meaning to, exhausted from too many emotions and not enough rest. I dreamed about a room with gray walls and a single window set too high to reach. The details were sharp and specific, the exact shade of gray, the way afternoon light came through at an angle, the sound of footsteps above. When I woke up, my heart was pounding and I couldn't tell if I'd remembered something real or if my brain was just filling in blanks with made-up images. The dream felt true, though, felt like memory rather than imagination, and that scared me more than not knowing. Mom brought breakfast on a tray the next morning, setting it down gently on the nightstand, like I might shatter if she moved too fast. She sat on the edge of the bed and asked if I remembered anything about my childhood, about growing up in this house. I did remember, clearly and completely. I remembered my room and the tree outside and family dinners and birthday parties. Those memories were intact and solid, nothing missing or confused about them. It was only the 6 years that were gone. Only that specific chunk of time erased like it never happened. The therapy appointment happened 2 days later in a small office that smelled like lavender and old books. Dr. Marquez was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes that studied me carefully when I sat down. She asked basic questions first, my name and where I was staying, things I could answer without thinking. Then she explained that my brain might be protecting me from memories I wasn't ready to handle yet. She said trauma does that sometimes, builds walls around the worst parts so you can function while you heal. The memories could come back slowly over weeks or months, or they might flood back all at once without warning. There was no way to predict which would happen or when. She spoke gently, but didn't treat me like I might break, which I appreciated more than the careful handling everyone else was doing. I asked if the memories were even real, or if my brain might be making things up to fill the empty space. She said recovered memories are usually accurate, but sometimes get mixed with imagination, especially when there's been psychological manipulation involved. That word manipulation made my stomach hurt even though I didn't know why. During our session, Marquez asked me to close my eyes and try to remember anything from the missing years, even just feelings or sensations without specific images. I sat there with my eyes shut for what felt like forever, searching through the blank space in my head. All I could find was this weird mix of feeling safe and scared at the same time, like being wrapped in a blanket that was also suffocating me. It didn't make any logical sense. Safe meant protected and calm. Scared meant danger and panic, but somehow I felt both things together when I tried to remember. Marquez wrote notes while I described it, her pen scratching across paper. She asked if the safety felt like being cared for or being controlled. I didn't know how to answer because they felt like the same thing. She said that was significant, that confusion between care and control, and we'd explore it more in future sessions. The appointment ended with her giving me a card with her emergency number, telling me to call any time if memories started coming back and I needed support. That evening, the phone rang while Mom and I were eating dinner in silence. She answered it in the kitchen, then brought the cordless phone to me with a worried expression. Harrison's voice came through asking how I was doing, if anything new had happened. I told him about the therapy session and the strange mixed feelings. He listened without interrupting, then said he had news. They'd identified the abandoned building where the janitor found me. It used to be the office complex where I worked 6 years ago, the same place I left from the day I disappeared. The building closed down 3 years after I went missing when the company relocated. Harrison said it was strange that I ended up back there. Like whoever kept me wanted me found in a specific location. He asked if that meant anything to me. I pressed the phone tight against my ear, trying to remember anything about that building beyond my normal work memories. Nothing came except a vague sense of importance I couldn't explain. Harrison wanted me to return to the building with him the next morning to see if being there would trigger any memories. Mom grabbed the phone from my hand before I could respond, telling Harrison it was too soon, that I needed more time to adjust before facing that place. Her voice got sharp and protective in a way I'd never heard before. I took the phone back and told Harrison I'd go. Mom stared at me like I'd lost my mind, shaking her head and mouthing the word no. But I needed answers more than I needed protection from whatever I might remember. Harrison said he'd pick me up at 9 and to dress comfortably. After I hung up, Mom tried to talk me out of it, saying I should wait until I was stronger, until the therapy had time to work. I told her I couldn't wait, that every day without knowing felt like drowning. She went quiet after that, just cleaned up dinner with tight, angry movements that showed how much she disagreed. The next morning, Harrison pulled up in an unmarked car that smelled like coffee and air freshener. Mom stood in the doorway watching us leave, arms crossed over her chest like she could hold me there through will alone. The drive took 20 minutes through streets I half remembered from before. Harrison talked about nothing important, the weather and traffic, giving me space to be nervous. When we pulled up to the building, my hands started shaking without my permission. It looked different from I remembered. More run down and empty, windows dark and parking lot cracked. We got out and Harrison unlocked the front door with a key the property owner had provided. Inside, the air was stale and dust covered everything in a thick gray layer. I walked through hallways that felt both known and strange, my feet remembering the path to where my desk used to be. I remembered working here, remembered my coworkers and the break room and boring meetings. But I didn't remember coming back here after I disappeared. Didn't remember anything that would explain waking up in that broom closet. When we reached the broom closet where the janitor found me, I stopped in the doorway like my body hit an invisible wall. Harrison waited behind me, not pushing, just present. Something about this small dark space felt hugely important, but I couldn't access why or what it meant. The walls were the same industrial beige as the rest of the building. Nothing special or memorable about them. A few old mops leaned in the corner and metal shelves held cleaning supplies covered in dust. I tried to step inside, but my legs wouldn't move forward. Harrison asked quietly if I was okay. I nodded even though I wasn't, forcing myself to take one step into the closet. The space was tiny, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, barely big enough to turn around in. Why would anyone leave me here specifically? Harrison asked if I recognized anything specific about the room. I scanned the walls slowly, looking for something that would explain this heavy feeling in my chest. Then I saw it. A small mark on the wall near the floor that looked like someone had scratched counting lines into the paint. 5 vertical lines with a diagonal slash through them, then another group of 5, then another. I counted 12 groups total. 60 marks. I didn't remember making them, but when I knelt down and traced the pattern with my fingers, my hand knew the motion. The scratches were shallow and uneven, like they'd been made with something dull, maybe a fingernail or the edge of a key. Harrison crouched beside me asking what I was doing. I told him about the marks and how my fingers seemed to know them even though my brain didn't. He took photos with his phone, the flash bright in the dim closet. Then he asked how long I thought someone would need to make 60 marks. I calculated automatically. 1 mark per day would be 60 days. But I didn't know if that's what they meant. Back at Mom's house, I went straight to my old bedroom without talking to anyone. She called after me asking how it went, but I couldn't form words to answer. I found myself standing at the window, the same one where the figure had appeared. My hand reached for the lock automatically, checking it even though I knew Mom had secured it. I stood there for an hour watching the street below, waiting for something I couldn't name. Cars passed occasionally, and neighbors walked dogs. Normal afternoon activity that felt foreign and distant. Part of me expected to see him again. The shadow from that first night, but the street stayed empty of anything unusual. Mom knocked on my door eventually asking if I wanted lunch. I said no without turning around. She didn't push, just left me standing there watching nothing happen. Winter showed up that afternoon without calling first, her small car pulling up loaded with boxes. I watched from my window as she struggled to carry them to the front door, then heard Mom let her in downstairs. Winter's voice carried up, bright and determined, saying she'd brought things I needed to see. I went down slowly, not sure I wanted to face more pieces of a past I couldn't quite remember. Winter had spread boxes across the living room floor, old photos and journals and papers scattered everywhere. She looked up when I appeared, her face lighting up with a smile that made her look younger than her 23 years. She said she'd been keeping everything safe, believing I'd come back someday and want to remember who I was before. Mom stood in the doorway looking uncertain, like she wasn't sure this was a good idea but didn't want to stop it either. Looking through my old journals was deeply disorienting, because I remembered writing these entries, remembered the person I was, but she felt like a complete stranger now. The handwriting was definitely mine, small and neat with the same weird way I made my capital E's, but the thoughts and feelings described belonged to someone I couldn't connect to anymore. I read about plans for trips I never took, career goals I never reached, friends I couldn't picture clearly. The last entry was from the morning I disappeared, talking about plans for the weekend that never happened. I was supposed to meet Nadine for coffee and go hiking on Sunday. The entry ended mid-sentence, like I'd been interrupted or run out of time. Winter watched me read with careful attention, probably looking for signs I was remembering something important. But all I felt was this strange grief for a person who used to exist and didn't anymore. Winter pulled out another box and opened it carefully, showing me a thick notebook with pages covered in her handwriting. She said she spent years collecting information online, following every lead no matter how small. I flipped through the pages, seeing newspaper articles, printed forum posts, witness statements she'd tracked down herself. One page had a timeline of the last day anyone saw me, marking every hour with what people reported. Winter's finger traced down to an entry about someone at the coffee shop near my office, who remembered a man asking questions about me that morning. The police had interviewed him, but nothing came of it. I stared at the description. Middle-aged, average height, kind face, and something twisted in my stomach. Winter asked if I recognized anything, and I shook my head even though that wasn't quite true. The words felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain, like hearing a song you know you've heard before but can't remember where. Winter showed me more notes about the man, how he'd been seen near the parking garage where I left my car. She'd spent hours trying to find security footage, but the building had been torn down years ago. I asked why she kept searching when everyone else gave up, and she said she just knew I was out there somewhere. Her certainty made my chest tight because I didn't know if I was worth all that faith. We went through more boxes until the sun started setting and Mom brought us dinner on paper plates. I couldn't eat much, my stomach too knotted up from all the information. Winter left around 8, hugging me tight and promising to come back tomorrow with more things she'd saved. After she drove away, I went upstairs to my old bedroom and sat on the bed staring at the window. The lock was still secure from when Mom checked it last night, but I felt exposed anyway, like someone was watching even though the street below was empty. I changed into pajamas Mom had bought me and turned off the lights, trying to sleep but knowing I wouldn't be able to. Around midnight I heard it, the soft scrape of the window opening. I sat up fast, my heart pounding but not entirely from fear. The shadow was back, standing in the yard below looking up at me. This time I didn't hesitate. I went to the window and pushed it open wider before he could disappear again. I asked who he was and what he wanted from me, my voice steadier than I felt. He stepped closer into the moonlight and I could see him clearly now. Roy Scruggs looked older than I expected, maybe late 50s, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. His expression seemed genuinely concerned as he asked if I was doing okay, He said coming back to the real world could be hard after being away so long. I should have screamed for Mom or grabbed my phone to call the police. Instead, I found myself leaning out the window asking him questions about where I'd been. He shook his head slowly and said I wasn't ready to know everything yet. The truth would come when I was strong enough to handle it. I asked what that meant, and he just looked at me with this sad patience like I was a child who didn't understand something important. Roy said he would answer one question tonight. Just one. So I needed to choose carefully. I thought about all the things I wanted to know. About the 6 missing years and the gray room and why I couldn't remember. Finally, I asked why he let me go. Roy's face changed. Something like surprise crossing it. He said he didn't let me go. That I left on my own when I was ready. That made no sense because I didn't remember leaving anywhere. Didn't remember making any choice at all. Before I could ask what he meant, Mom's voice called up the stairs asking who I was talking to. Roy stepped back into the shadows, and by the time I turned around, he was gone. I pulled the window closed and locked it just as Mom opened my bedroom door. She looked worried, asking if everything was okay. I told her I'd been on the phone with Winter and she seemed to accept that, reminding me to get some sleep before heading back downstairs. I sat on my bed shaking, not from fear but from confusion about what just happened. I should have told Mom the truth, should have called Harrison immediately, but something stopped me. Some part of me I didn't understand wanted to protect Roy, even though that made no sense at all. I lay awake for hours trying to figure out why I'd lied, why I hadn't screamed or fought or done anything normal people do when confronted by someone who hurt them. The thought scared me more than Roy's presence at my window because it meant something was wrong with me, something he'd done that I couldn't see or understand yet. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, but clear-headed about what I needed to do. I called Harrison before Mom woke up and told him everything about Roy's visit. He went quiet for a long moment, then said he was sending officers to watch the house immediately. He asked me to come to the station to look at photos of registered offenders in the area. I got dressed and Mom drove me downtown, neither of us talking much. At the station, Harrison had a thick binder of photos ready. I went through page after page of faces, men who'd been convicted of various crimes, but none of them were Roy. Harrison watched me carefully as I finished the last page and shook my head. He explained that without a last name or better description, finding Roy would be difficult. He wanted me to work with a sketch artist to create a detailed image they could distribute. I agreed and spent 2 hours with a patient woman who asked specific questions about Roy's features. But every time I tried to describe his face, the details got fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream that slips away as you wake up. I could picture him clearly in my mind, but translating that into words felt impossible. The sketch artist did her best with what I gave her, but the final drawing looked generic and wrong, like it could be anyone. I left the station feeling worse than when I arrived. Harrison called that evening saying they'd gotten some leads on possible Roy Scruggs matches in the area, but nothing solid yet. He mentioned that a therapist named Dahlia Williamson had reached out to him after hearing about my case. She worked with people who'd been held captive for long periods, and wanted to help if I was interested. I told him I'd think about it, but honestly, the idea of talking to another stranger about things I couldn't even remember made me tired. Mom sat with me that night while we ate dinner in silence, both of us picking at our food. She kept looking at me like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. I went to bed early and stared at the ceiling for hours, my mind going in circles about Roy's face that I could picture clearly, but couldn't describe, about the 6 years I couldn't remember, about the person I used to be who felt like a complete stranger now. The next morning, Harrison called again saying Dahlia had offered to meet with me for free, that she really thought she could help. Something in his voice made me agree even though I didn't want to. Mom drove me to Dahlia's office 3 days later in a small building downtown. The waiting room had soft chairs and quiet music that was probably supposed to be calming, but just made me more nervous. When Dahlia came out to get me, she looked normal, maybe 40 years old with brown hair pulled back and kind eyes that didn't look at me like I was broken. Her office had a couch and some chairs, big windows with plants on the sill, nothing that felt clinical or scary. She asked me to sit wherever I felt comfortable, and I picked the chair farthest from the door without really thinking about it. Dahlia sat across from me with a notebook, but didn't write anything down yet. She started by asking simple questions about how I was sleeping and eating, whether I felt safe at my mother's house, if I was having any physical pain. I answered honestly that I couldn't sleep much, that food didn't taste right, that I felt safe but also strange being back. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. She wanted to know how I felt about Roy, the man who took me. My throat got tight and I looked at the floor. I told her I didn't know how to feel about someone I couldn't remember. She nodded like she expected that answer and asked a different way. When I thought about him, when I pictured his face at my window, what did I feel? I sat there for a long time trying to find the right words. Finally, I admitted that part of me wasn't afraid of him, that seeing him had felt almost familiar in a way that didn't make sense. I waited for her to look shocked or concerned, but she just kept that same calm expression. She said that was actually pretty common in cases like mine. I asked what she meant by cases like mine, and she explained something called Stockholm Syndrome. It's when people who are held captive start to feel connected to their captors as a way to survive. She said our brains do it automatically to protect us, that it doesn't mean I'm broken, or that what happened was okay. Hearing her say it was common made something loosen in my chest that I didn't know was tight. We kept talking, and she asked me to try to remember anything at all from the past 6 years, even if it seemed small or unimportant. I closed my eyes and tried to push past the blank space in my head. Then suddenly I saw something. Just a flash, but clear. I was sitting at a small table eating dinner. Something with pasta, I think. And Roy was across from me asking about my day. Not demanding or angry, just asking like it was normal. Like we were roommates or friends. The memory felt so ordinary and domestic that it disturbed me more than if I'd remembered something violent or scary. I opened my eyes and told Dahlia what I'd seen. She leaned forward slightly and said that was really important. That my first recovered memory being of routine rather than trauma told her something significant. She thought my captivity might have been more about psychological control than physical violence. The idea made my stomach turn because it meant Roy had gotten inside my head in ways I still couldn't see or understand. Dahlia said we'd work through it together, that recovering memories would take time and we'd go at whatever pace felt right. I left her office feeling strange, like something had shifted, but I couldn't tell if it was good or bad. That night I dreamed about the gray room again, but this time I could see more details. There was a bookshelf against one wall filled with novels, their spines all different colors. A comfortable chair sat near the window with a reading lamp beside it. I could see a small kitchen area with a sink and a hot plate, a few dishes stacked neatly. The room looked less like a prison cell and more like a studio apartment, the kind of place someone might choose to live. When I woke up, I was crying without knowing why, tears running down my face and soaking into my pillow. Mom must have heard me because she came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed. She didn't ask questions, just pulled me against her and held me while I sobbed. I realized through the crying that I was grieving for something I couldn't even remember losing, mourning a life I'd lived that was completely gone from my mind. Mom stroked my hair and whispered that it was okay, that I was safe now, but her words felt hollow because I didn't feel safe at all. Winter showed up the next afternoon with a laptop and a determined expression. She said she wanted to show me something and pulled up news articles about my disappearance. The first ones were from 6 years ago with my photo everywhere, headlines about the missing woman whose car was found by the river. There were stories about search parties and press conferences where Mom stood at a microphone begging anyone with information to come forward. Winter scrolled through months of coverage, showing me how the story had been huge at first, but slowly faded as weeks passed without new leads. By the 6-month mark, there were only occasional updates, and after a year, the articles stopped completely. She showed me one piece from about 3 years ago, a Where Are They Now story about cold cases. One article caught my attention because it mentioned that police had initially suspected I might have run away on purpose. They'd found no sign of struggle at my car, and the blood turned out to be from a minor cut on my hand, not evidence of violence. The article said investigators had to consider the possibility that I'd left my old life behind voluntarily. Reading that made me feel sick because it suggested I'd chosen to disappear, that I'd abandoned my family without any explanation. Winter saw my face and quickly said the police had to look at every option, that it didn't mean they really believed it. She told me she never once thought I would leave without telling anyone, that she'd spent years trying to prove something bad had happened instead. Harrison called 2 days later saying an FBI agent wanted to talk to me. Louis Barnett specialized in long-term abduction cases, and he'd heard about mine through law enforcement channels. He was interested because most captives showed clear signs of aging and physical trauma, but I looked exactly the same as my missing person photos. Harrison said Barnett had worked cases where captors used unusual methods to keep their victims compliant, and he thought my situation fit that pattern. The interview happened at the police station the next morning. Barnett was maybe 50 with gray hair and tired eyes that studied me carefully when we shook hands. He sat across from me at a metal table and opened a thick folder full of notes. He asked about my physical condition first, whether I remembered any medical procedures or medications I might have been given. I told him I didn't remember anything like that, just waking up in the broom closet. He made notes and asked if I felt any pain anywhere, any old injuries that might have healed. I shook my head. He switched topics and asked about my emotional state during captivity, whether I felt afraid or safe or something else. I told him about the strange mix of feelings I couldn't explain, how part of me felt protected even though I knew something was wrong. He wrote that down and nodded like it made sense to him. Barnett explained that some captors don't use physical force to keep their victims from leaving. Instead, they use psychological conditioning techniques that break down a person's sense of self and rebuild it around dependency. He asked if I remembered anyone teaching me things or establishing rules I had to follow. As he said it, something clicked in my head. I saw Roy sitting across from me at that small table, speaking in his calm, steady voice. He was explaining that the outside world was dangerous and chaotic, full of people who would hurt me or use me. He said I was safer with him where nothing bad could touch me, where I could be quiet and peaceful. In that memory, I believed every word completely. My whole body felt the truth of it. I blinked and came back to the interview room. Barnett was watching me closely. I told him about the memory, and he leaned forward slightly. He said that was exactly consistent with psychological grooming and isolation tactics. Captors who use these methods spend months or even years systematically breaking down their victim's sense of reality and rebuilding it around complete dependency on the captor. He believed Roy had done exactly that to me. The revelation made my stomach turn because it meant I'd been complicit in my own captivity. I'd stayed because he convinced me I wanted to, because he'd gotten so far inside my head that his voice became my own thoughts. Barnett said many survivors felt that way, but it was important to understand that conditioning removed real choice. When someone controls every aspect of your environment and information, they control your ability to make free decisions. I left the station feeling worse than when I'd arrived. That evening I had another session with Dahlia and told her what Barnett had explained. She listened carefully, and then said something that helped a little. She explained that grooming does exactly what its name suggests. It shapes and molds a person into what the groomer wants them to be. It wasn't my choice in any real sense because Roy had systematically removed my ability to choose. The person who stayed with him was created by isolation and manipulation, not by my actual wants or desires. She said understanding that was crucial to my recovery. Meanwhile, Harrison's team kept working the investigation. 3 days after my interview with Barnett, they found security footage from a gas station 3 blocks from my mother's house. The timestamp showed it was from the night Roy appeared at my window. They enhanced the image and finally had a clear photo of his face. Harrison called me to the station to confirm it was him. I looked at the screen and nodded. That was definitely Roy. The photo got distributed to every law enforcement agency in the state and released to local media with a request for anyone who recognized him to come forward. The response was faster than anyone expected. Within 4 hours, they got a call from a landlord who rented a rural property about 40 minutes outside the city. He said his tenant matched the photo exactly. A quiet man who paid rent on time and never caused problems. The landlord gave them the address. Police surrounded the property that evening with full tactical support. Harrison called to tell me they were going in. I sat on my mother's couch gripping my phone and waiting. An hour later, Harrison called back. Roy wasn't there. But what they found instead was the gray room from my dreams. Exactly as I'd remembered it. One room in a small house with gray walls, a bookshelf full of novels, a comfortable chair by the window, a small kitchen area. And in a drawer, they found 6 years' worth of journals, all written in my handwriting. Harrison came to the house the next morning with some of the journals in evidence bags. He said I didn't have to read them, but they might help me remember. I took them to my room and opened the first one. The date on the first entry was 2 days after I disappeared. Reading them felt like watching someone else's life unfold on the pages. I wrote about daily routines, what books I was reading, conversations with Roy about philosophy and art. The tone was calm and content, like I was describing a peaceful retreat instead of captivity. One entry talked about how Roy brought me new art supplies, and I spent the afternoon painting. Another described making dinner together and discussing a documentary we'd watched. There was no fear in these pages, no desperation to escape, just ordinary life written in my own familiar handwriting. I kept reading through the journals and found an entry from 3 years into my captivity. The date at the top made my stomach turn because I remembered nothing from that time, yet there was my handwriting filling page after page. The entry described a conversation where Roy explained why he took me. I read my own words saying I seemed lost and unhappy in my old life, that I was searching for something I couldn't find. Then the next line made me feel sick. I'd written that Roy was right, that I had been searching for purpose and he helped me find peace. I stared at those words for a long time, trying to understand how I could have written them. The handwriting was definitely mine, the way I formed certain letters, the slight slant to the right, but the thoughts felt completely foreign, like someone else had controlled my hand while I wrote. I wanted to throw the journals across the room or burn them, so no one would ever see what I'd written about my captor. My hands shook as I closed the notebook and pushed it away from me. I called Dahlia even though it was late because I couldn't be alone with what I'd just read. She came to my mother's house within an hour and sat with me while I showed her the entry. She read it carefully without any shock or judgment on her face. When she finished, she explained that the journals were important evidence of the psychological manipulation I'd gone through. The person who wrote those entries praising Roy was created by trauma and isolation, not by my real thoughts or feelings. Dahlia said reading them would be painful but necessary for understanding what happened to me. Over the following days, more memories started coming back in fragments and pieces. I remembered the gray room in more detail now, how Roy brought me books from the library and asked which ones I wanted to read next. He gave me art supplies and hung my paintings on the walls like they mattered. He asked my opinion about movies we watched together and current events he told me about. The memories showed him treating me like a partner in our strange little life, rather than a prisoner, and that realization made everything worse somehow. I remembered conversations where he asked about my day, even though we both knew I'd spent it in that one room. He cooked meals and we ate together at the small table, discussing the books I'd read or the art I'd made. In my memories, I smiled sometimes and laughed at things he said. I participated in the life he'd created for us like it was normal and acceptable. Another memory surfaced that made me understand how deep his manipulation went. I remembered the day Roy told me I could leave whenever I wanted, that the door wasn't locked and never had been. He said I was free to walk out anytime and return to my old life if that's what I chose. I remembered feeling complete terror at the thought of leaving that gray room. The outside world seemed huge and chaotic and dangerous compared to the quiet safety of the space he'd created. I remembered thinking about my old life, the job I didn't like, and the apartment that always felt empty, and convincing myself I was better off where I was. The memory of choosing to stay, of actively deciding not to leave, made me feel complicit in what happened to me. I met with Dahlia again and told her about remembering the unlocked door. She listened carefully, and then explained something that helped me understand. She said Roy's greatest manipulation was making me believe I chose to stay. He spent years isolating me from everything I knew, controlling all my information about the outside world, until his presence became my entire reality, and leaving felt impossible. The choice he offered wasn't real because he'd systematically removed my ability to make free decisions. Dahlia said understanding that difference was crucial for my recovery. Meanwhile, Barnett's team kept working on analyzing my journals and processing evidence from the property. 3 days after I read the disturbing entry, Barnett called Harrison with new information about Roy. They'd built a profile using my journals, property records, and background checks. Roy Scruggs was 58 years old with no criminal record of any kind. He'd worked as a licensed counselor for 20 years before retiring early at age 52, which was right around the time I disappeared. The counseling background explained everything about Roy's skill at psychological manipulation. Barnett told Harrison that Roy likely identified me as vulnerable and used therapeutic techniques twisted for control rather than healing. He would have known exactly how to break down my sense of self and rebuild it around complete dependence on him. The training that should have helped people instead became a weapon he used to keep me trapped. Winter called me that same evening with something she'd found while going through my old social media accounts. She'd been searching for any clues about the days before I disappeared and found a post from a week before it happened. I'd written about feeling stuck in my life and wanting to start over somewhere new. The post talked about being unhappy at work and wondering if there was more to life than what I was living. Winter said Roy must have seen it and identified me as a target, someone vulnerable enough to manipulate. The police finally got the break they needed when a motel manager 2 hours away recognized Roy's photo from the news. Officers surrounded the motel and found Roy in his room. He came with them willingly without any resistance or attempt to run. In his interview at the police station, Roy insisted he never hurt me. He said he gave me the peace and safety I was searching for, that he saw someone lost and helped them find their way. The detective conducting the interview asked him about taking me against my will, and Roy acted confused by the question. He said I chose to stay with him, that I was happier in the life we built together than I'd been before. Harrison called me to the station the next day and showed me the interview footage on a computer screen. Watching Roy sit calmly in that chair and explain his actions felt surreal and wrong. He genuinely believed he helped me, that taking me was an act of compassion rather than violence. His face showed no guilt or shame as he described the 6 years we spent together. He talked about me like I was a success story, someone he'd saved from an unhappy life. The detective asked if he understood that keeping someone against their will was a crime, and Roy said I wasn't kept against my will because the door was never locked. He said I chose to stay because I finally found the peace I'd been searching for, and he was proud to have given me that gift. Harrison played another part of the interview where Roy explained that he brought me back to the office building because that's where we first met, where he first saw me looking lost and unhappy. Roy said on the video that I was finally ready to rejoin the world after 6 years of healing and growth, that he was proud of how much I'd changed during our time together. The way he talked about it made it sound like I graduated from some kind of program instead of escaping captivity. Harrison stopped the video and told me the district attorney wanted to meet with me the next day to discuss the case. The DA's office was downtown in a tall building with security checkpoints. A woman named Jasmine Ching met me in a conference room and spread out copies of my journals across the table. She explained that prosecuting Roy would be harder than normal kidnapping cases because my journals and his statements suggested I wasn't physically kept against my will. The law required them to prove psychological pressure and control, which was trickier to show in court than locked doors or physical restraints. Jasmine said they needed my testimony to explain how Roy broke down my identity and rebuilt it around depending on him completely. She warned me it would be difficult to talk about publicly, but my words were the strongest evidence they had. 2 weeks later, I sat in a grand jury room with 23 strangers staring at me from tiered seats. The prosecutor asked me to describe my captivity, and I had to explain how Roy slowly cut me off from everything I knew until his world became my only world. I told them about the unlocked door I never tried to open, because leaving felt impossible and dangerous. I described how Roy used therapy techniques to make me question my own memories and desires, until I couldn't tell what I actually wanted anymore. Speaking these truths out loud to a room full of people were harder than anything I'd done since coming back. My voice shook and I had to stop several times to breathe, but I kept going because they needed to understand what psychological captivity meant. The grand jury took less than an hour to indict Roy on kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment charges. Jasmine called me that evening and said my testimony was strong and compelling. She explained that the journals actually helped prove manipulation instead of consent, because they showed the progression of how Roy changed my thinking over time. Reading my own words about feeling safe and cared for would help the jury understand how complete his control became. Nadine organized a small gathering at her house 3 days after the indictment with people from my old office. Walking into a room full of former coworkers felt strange because they all remembered the person I was before, and I was still trying to figure out who that was. They asked careful questions about how I was doing and shared stories about things we did together that I barely remembered. Everyone was kind, but I could see them studying my face and trying to find the Emily they knew in the person standing in front of them. I left after an hour because being around people who knew the old me made me feel like I was failing at being her. My mother and I started going to therapy together the following week with a counselor who worked with families dealing with trauma. The sessions were hard because my mother kept crying about losing 6 years with me, while I tried to explain that I lost those years too in a different way. She was sad about the daughter who disappeared, and I was sad about the person I might have been without Roy. Our therapist said we were both dealing with grief over different losses and learning to connect as the people we were now instead of who we used to be. The trial started 4 months after I came back, and I went to the courthouse every single day, even though watching the proceedings made me exhausted. I needed to see Roy in a context where his power over me was completely gone, where other people controlled what happened to him instead of him controlling everything about my life. He sat at the defense table in a suit, looking calm and sad, like he couldn't understand why everyone was treating him like a criminal. His lawyer argued that I stayed voluntarily, and the journals proved I was happy. But the prosecutor used those same journals to show how Roy systematically destroyed my ability to make free choices. Witnesses testified about psychological coercion, and expert psychologists explained how captors use isolation and manipulation to control their victims without physical force. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury came back with guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge sentenced Roy to 20 years, and as the bailiffs led him away, he looked directly at me with an expression that seemed genuinely sad. I could tell he still believed he helped me instead of hurting me, that taking me was an act of kindness rather than violence. After the sentencing, I met with Dahlia, and we talked about what came next now that the legal part was finished. She said I needed to focus on building a life that belonged to me instead of one shaped by Roy, or by everyone's expectations of who I should be. I enrolled in community college classes because going back to my old career felt impossible, like trying to wear clothes that belonged to someone else. The courses were basic, but starting over felt right somehow. Winter called me most days and invited me to do normal things like getting coffee or going to the bookstore. She introduced me to her friends and included me in group activities, always patient when crowds made me nervous or when unexpected changes threw me off. We went to movies and farmers markets, and she never pushed me to talk about the trial or Roy unless I brought it up first. Having someone who just let me exist without constantly checking if I was okay helped more than any therapy session. My mother and I found a new way of being together, where she stopped trying to get her old daughter back and I stopped feeling guilty for not being that person anymore. We had dinner twice a week and talked honestly about our feelings instead of pretending everything was fine. She told me about the years she spent searching and grieving, and I told her about slowly remembering pieces of my captivity. Neither of us would ever get back what we lost, but we could build something new between us. 6 months after coming back, I moved into my own apartment. Just a small studio, but it was mine. I got a part-time job at a bookstore which felt manageable and safe. Dahlia and I still met every week and probably would for a long time because healing from 6 years of psychological manipulation didn't happen quickly. Some days were harder than others, and sometimes I still felt Roy's influence in how I thought about myself and the world. But I was learning to recognize those patterns and challenge them, to build my own identity separate from what he created. Winter helped me pick out furniture for my apartment, and we spent a whole Saturday assembling a bookshelf and hanging curtains. She made everything feel normal and possible instead of overwhelming and impossible. I was finally moving forward as myself, whoever that turned out to be, instead of as the person Roy made or the person everyone remembered. My mother stopped trying to get her old daughter back around the same time I stopped feeling guilty about not being that person anymore. We started having dinner at her house twice a week, usually Tuesdays and Fridays, and we talked about real things instead of pretending everything was fine. She told me about the support group she joined after I disappeared, about the other parents who lost children and never got them back. I told her about the things I remembered from captivity, the small details that came back in pieces. We both cried sometimes during these dinners, but it felt different from before, like we were sad together instead of sad at each other. She accepted that I moved differently now, talked differently, made choices she wouldn't have expected from the daughter she remembered. I accepted that she would always carry grief for the person I might have been without those 6 missing years, but we could still be something to each other, something real and honest even if it looked different from what we lost. 6 months after coming back, I signed the lease on a small studio apartment 3 blocks from the bookstore where I worked part-time. The apartment had one big room with a kitchen area in the corner and windows that looked out at a parking lot, but it was mine. Winter helped me pick out a bed and a table, and we spent a whole Saturday putting together a bookshelf and hanging cheap curtains. The bookstore job felt manageable because it was quiet and predictable, just shelving books and helping customers find things and running the register during slow afternoon shifts. I still met with Dahlia every Thursday, and probably would for years because 6 years of psychological manipulation didn't heal quickly or easily. Some days I felt almost normal, going to work and cooking dinner and texting Winter about nothing important. Other days I woke up feeling Roy's presence like he was still watching me, still shaping how I thought about myself and the world. But I was learning to recognize those patterns when they showed up, learning to challenge the voice in my head that sounded like his voice. I was building a life that belonged to me instead of one shaped by what he created or what everyone expected me to be. Moving forward as myself, whoever that turned out to be.